Let me first welcome you all to this webinar. My name is Alice Tipping and I lead the trade and trade policy work at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the IFDA. Many of you will be very familiar with us and our work, but some of you may not. So as a very brief introduction, we're a think tank, a non-profit organization based in Canada, but with a large office in Geneva, Switzerland, where I'm based and many of my team are. And from this office, we do a lot of work on trade and trade policy, and specifically providing a lot of support to developing and least developing countries who are engaged in negotiations at the World Trade Organization. And this is where this webinar comes in. So this webinar is one of two that we're running this week. Today's is on the Investment Facilitation for Development negotiations, and then another on Thursday on the e-commerce Joint Statement Initiative talks. And these webinars are both part of a project funded by the Government of the United Kingdom under the Trade Advocacy Fund, the TAF Fund. And this project essentially has enabled us, IISD, along with partners, to provide confidential technical support to developing and least developed country negotiators, that's all of you, both in Geneva and in capitals, helping you essentially to follow these very fast-moving and very technical discussions and providing you with confidential updates and technical briefings on the quite difficult technical topics under negotiation. So this webinar takes advantage of the fact that the Investment Facilitation for Development negotiations reached a substantial level of conclusion towards the end of last year. And we thought it would be a good moment in the lead up to MC13, the WTO's ministerial conference at the end of next month, to provide a sort of a synthesis and a good overview of what is in this new treaty. This webinar has been open to all developing and least developed country members of the WTO. Whether you are engaged in the investment facilitation negotiations or not, it's designed to give you an objective, sustainable development focused view of what is in this agreement. And for that, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers. So my very last comment is to thank very much my colleagues Rashid Kaukab and Rashmi Jose, who have put together the substance of this, to thank very much our speakers, who you'll hear from in a moment, and to thank very much our technical team, who have put together all of this, and the interpreters, who you will find ready to help you interpret this into Spanish or French at the bottom of your screen. That's it from me. That's the end of the opening remarks. And I will hand on now to my dear colleague, Rashid Kaukab, who's our Senior Specialist on Trade and Sustainable Development, who will be moderating the rest of this hour. But thank you very much for joining us, and I'm looking forward to some very interesting exchanges. So Rashid, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alice, for that wonderful introduction. Let me also welcome you all, the participants and the panelists for this webinar, and a very warm welcome as well as good afternoon from a sunny, nice winter day in Geneva. But those of you who are joining us from somewhere in Latin America and the Caribbean, good morning. And those who are joining us from Asia, I know definitely Professor Kalamita is joining us from Singapore, so good evening. This, as Alice very ably described, this is under a project that we have been implementing since early 2020. This is actually the fourth phase of the project, which is going to come to an end by March of this year. And in that project, the support we provide has two key principles. One is neutrality. So we are here to help you through technical analysis, but not to tell any developing country or least developed country what positions to take or whether to join the GSI or not. Also, a big part of this project is the confidentiality. We respect that, and which means that, like always in today's webinar also, we will not be recording the interventions from the floor, your questions from the participants. So be totally rest assured that is on Chatham House basis, because for us that is very important that we have your trust. As part of the final word about this project, in addition to the seminars, we also provide ad hoc support, which is bilateral through a request. So if you would like to have more information, analysis, our technical notes, so please feel free to contact our colleague Rashmi Jose or me, and we'll be happy to respond to that. Now, quickly moving to this current webinar, as Alice very aptly said, this is coming at a very important time. The substantive negotiations concluded, the ministerial coming up, the issue of legal architecture and how to move forward to the next phase of this agreement are the key questions that countries are dealing with, and expected that some things may come out by the time of the ministerial, which is in a few weeks' time. So in this time, we also are very cognizant that many developing countries and LDCs, because of their capacity constraints, may not have been able to follow the agreement, its negotiations, and its implications. So that's why we believe this is quite an opportune time to have this webinar with a view to, and that takes me straight to the structure of this short webinar as well, to brief you, first of all, on the state of play. Then moving into a quick but clear analysis, information on the agreement itself, at the draft agreement as it stands. And then from there, moving on to two very key issues, the development dimension, as well as the possible implementation challenges. So these are the topics that we would like to cover in this short seminar. And as Ella said, we have an excellent set of speakers, and we are very grateful to them that they found the time to join us today. Before I give the floor to our first speaker, let me just say a few words about some logistics as well. Everybody's an expert on Zoom now, so I need to say anything there. But we do have interpretation facility. So there is simultaneous interpretation into Spanish and French, while the main proceedings are in English. And you can see the interpretation icon, and you can click and switch to the interpretation that you would like to hear. We, again, since this is confidentiality is important to us, we will be recording the presentations, and these will be shared with you and the PowerPoints later on, but your questions and comments will not be recorded. Finally, the feedback is very important to us. We always want to know how did we do, how can we improve, do better in the future. So somewhere during the course of the webinar, our colleagues, IISD colleagues, will put up this questionnaire on your screen. So please take a couple of minutes to fill it, because as I said, having your honest, frank feedback is extremely, extremely important for us. So thank you very much again for joining us today. And with this introduction, my pleasure to invite the first speaker. And this is Ambassador Sofia Boza Martinez. She is the ambassador and permanent representative of the permanent mission of Chile to the WTO, and she's also co-coordinator of this JSI. We are very grateful to her that she, despite this being a very busy time, that she found the time to join us, because she would be the best person to tell us about the state of play of the JSI, where do we stand and where do we want to go. So Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, a good afternoon all, and thank you very much for convening this webinar, and thank you very much for the kind invitation to provide you with a brief state of play on this initiative. I absolutely agree with you that this is a very, very good moment for outreach activities. So I, again, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. Well, as you know, over the last decades, many countries have adopted policies aimed at facilitating investment to attract, retain, and expand foreign investment flows. In that context, in April 2017, a group of developing and least developed country members of the WTO launched an informal dialogue on investment facilitation for development. At the 11th WTO Ministerial Conference held in Buenos Aires in 2017, in December, 70 WTO members co-sponsored a joint ministerial statement calling for the start of structured discussions with the aim of developing a multilateral framework on investment facilitation. After over 2 years of preparatory work and discussions, the participants formally launched negotiations on an agreement on investment facilitation for development, which we call IFDA agreement, in September 2020. Participation in this joint initiative has always been open to all WTO members since the very beginning. After 3 years, on July the 6th, 2023, more than 110 members of the WTO, what we call the participants, concluded the text of the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement. As of today, there are 118 WTO members participating on this initiative, being Cameroon the last member to join. Between July and November 2023, IFD participants carried out and concluded the technical adjustments and legal review of the English text of the open-ended plurilateral IFD agreement, in which the final version of the agreement was circulated to all WTO members on November 27 and the document INF/IFD/W/52. After November, 2 translated versions of the document were prepared, one in Spanish and one in French, and were circulated to interested delegations for the comments. In addition, a meeting was held in December, in which 2 working groups were set up in order to review the translated versions of the IFD agreement. The review of the French and Spanish versions of the IFD agreement is currently ongoing, in which working groups are meeting continuously, and we expect to complete it as soon as possible, hopefully by the end of January. In addition, during the General Council dated December 13, 2023, we, the co-coordinators of this initiative, informed the WTO whole membership that IFD participants have finalized the English text of the IFD agreement. After completing the legal review, as I have already mentioned, which constituted a major achievement. Members in that meeting were also informed that IFD participants intend to make a request in due course to add the IFD agreement to Annex 4 of the Marrakesh Agreement, establishing the WTO, that is, as an open-ended plurilateral agreement. Finally, during that meeting, that General Council, members were also informed that in order to achieve such incorporation, the co-coordinators wished to engage with all the WTO members with a view to garnering consensus in order for the IFD agreement to produce its pro-development benefits. As you may know, a vast number of WTO members, even some non-participants, took the floor at that meeting at the General Council the 13th December and welcomed this milestone and supported our intention to incorporate this agreement into the WTO legal architecture. In addition, participants have been working on a joint ministerial declaration, which will be signed by participants at a side event in the margins of the next ministerial conference in Abu Dhabi. There, it is also expected that ministers will discuss the incorporation of the IFD agreement into the WTO legal architecture. And about the benefits of this agreement, why do we think this agreement is relevant? The IFD agreement focuses on foreign direct investment in all economic sectors, as clearly stated by IFD participants since the beginning of the initiative. Therefore, the IFD agreement is different from bilateral investment agreements as it explicitly excludes, but I know that Rashmi will tell you more about that, market access, investment protection, and investor-state dispute settlement. The IFD agreement also includes a so-called firewall provision aimed at insulating the agreement from international investment agreements to prevent the spillover effects of the IFD agreement to international investment agreements and vice versa. On the economic impacts of this agreement, a study analyzing the potential economic impacts of an IFDA agreement at the WTO shows empirically relevant gains associated with the implementation of investment facilitation measures. According to the study, the expected global welfare gains derived from implementation range between 0.56% and 1.74%. So we are talking about billions of dollars. So a couple more comments of why this agreement is something so relevant. Well, the main aim of this agreement is not only attracting and retaining more investment, but also higher quality investment, taking into account the respective development priorities of the members by enhancing transparency, accountability, and good governance in investment procedures. The agreement will also foster a business climate more conducive to sustainable development. The text is the first one at the WTO, negotiated at the WTO, containing provisions that address issues as responsible business conduct and measures against corruption. So it goes beyond more investment, but also high quality investment and sustainable development. And finally, this agreement also constitutes a major milestone, particularly on its strong pro-development implementing mechanism in the form of an IFD needs assessment that will signal what the agreement has to offer to developing and least developed countries in terms of technical assistance and capacity building to help them attract more sustainable investment. But I know that we have Joel with us and he can explain more about that. So in sum, we have an English version of the text, which is already finalized, even with legal scrubbing and technical revision. We are finalizing the versions in Spanish and in French. We will have a side event at the ministerial level at the MC13. We are working on the legal incorporation, and all this hard work is because we are convinced and we have proof that this agreement will help very much to increase investment, not only quantity, but also quality, to pursue sustainable development, especially for developing an LDCs. And the agreement itself has elements to help developing an LDCs to implement its provisions. So thank you very much, and I remain at your disposal for question and answer at a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Boza. That was excellent, clear, concise, to briefly explain the main features and provisions of this draft agreement before we proceed into development issues and implementation challenges. So Rashmi, the floor is yours, about 15-20 minutes.
Sorry about that. I had a hard time finding the unmute button. Just a little disclaimer, I'm in the midst of a flu, so I might have a bit of fits and starts every now and then, but hopefully we'll be able to get through this smoothly. This presentation is going to last roughly 20 minutes, and it's going to cover 3 key parts. Before I go into the agreement itself, I'm actually going to take some time to spend some time on the broader context, to explain how investment facilitation provisions are really evolving at the bilateral and regional level. I'll then talk about the agreement itself, why it matters, give a sense of what's in the agreement, and then also touch on a few points on what can be expected in the run-up to MC13. So why is it important to look at the broader context? Well, one important reason is because, at least historically, the WTO is not the usual forum in which these types of provisions, investment facilitation provisions, have been negotiated through.
Instead, they tend to more often be negotiated via treaties that focus on investment policy making, i.e. via bilateral investment treaties. And interestingly, even within these treaties, actually, at least previously, investment facilitation provisions weren't all that common because more often these treaties focused on investment liberalization and investment protection provisions. But that trend is changing. UNCTAD's released a really useful policy brief that assesses that, especially since 2015, there's more and more countries essentially willing to integrate investment facilitation provisions within their international investment agreements. Not only have these provisions become much more popular, but there's also a great deal of experimentation taking place, with countries essentially willing to integrate a much more diverse set of provisions, as well as engage in deeper sets of commitments on this matter. So essentially, it's an indication that investment facilitation is really something that countries are open to, at least via bilateral and regional level of governance. As you can see in this graph, it gives you an indication on the investment facilitation features that are integrated in recent IIAs. Transparency provisions are really the most popular. Surprisingly, streamlining provisions not as much, which was a surprise. Cooperation focused provisions are also quite popular, especially those that aim to strengthen the linkages between the host states and between the local suppliers and investors. And finally, provisions that are enhancing, that aim to facilitate sustainability-focused investments are also beginning to get increasingly featured. Not only are countries willing to integrate standalone provisions into their investment treaties, but there are also some important cases where countries are actually negotiating full treaties that are dedicated to this topic entirely. Brazil is an important example, having negotiated several investment treaties that are just focused on investment facilitation. And the EU has become, it's a recent addition. They've just concluded negotiating their first investment facilitation treaty with Angola. And they've indicated that they plan to negotiate additional treaties on investment facilitation with other African partner countries. So, I mean, so the reason I'm emphasizing this is that when you're looking at this topic of investment facilitation, it really is important to not just look at it from a trade regime perspective, but really keep an eye on understanding what's happening within the investment governance, investment regime as well, investment policy regime as well. Because that's really, at least historically, where a lot of the trend evolution has taken place. And there's an indication that there's a lot more innovation that's been, and movement continuing to take place there. So really, you have to look at this topic from a comprehensive perspective if there is movement going forward. So now let's head back to the WTO. In this case, a subset of WTO members, the numbers here aren't updated. We now know it's 118 members after having engaged in a 6-year process starting in 2017, just delivered a really important milestone where they agreed on the legal text, a finalized version of the legal text of the agreement this last year. Now, if that text is eventually formalized, and if this agreement does get integrated within the WTO framework, it does have the potential to have a huge impact within the broader international governance sphere. And that's because even though this agreement is a plurilateral arrangement at present, because there are so many parties that have indicated that they're willing to sign on to it, what this means is if this agreement does go through, it essentially has the potential of becoming a new global benchmark. It's going to set a new minimum standard on what is expected out of investment facilitation rulemaking. So yes, the WTO is not the usual forum, but if this agreement were to go through, it will have a huge impact within the broader governance sphere. So now let me just take some time to go into the actual agreement itself to give a sense of what are the kinds of commitments so many parties have indicated that they're willing to take on. There are 7 sections with 45 articles. So I won't be able to go into the details, but I will highlight a few interesting points here and there just for you to get a good sense. So this first section is on the scope and general principles. And of course, its main purpose is to essentially introduce the objectives, explain how this agreement relates to other international agreements, and then also highlights the non-discrimination principles that apply. In this case, the MFN principle and not the non-national treatment principle. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I do think it's important to emphasize, to highlight one point on the scope. The scope is sometimes mentioned by non-participants as a reason. Their concerns on the scope is often mentioned as a reason as to why they're currently not engaging in the process. They've indicated that the scope is quite broad because essentially the agreement is meant to apply to domestic measures, all types of domestic measures that aim to target FDI activities. These domestic measures can be implemented by government agencies, regardless of whether they're central agencies, regional or local levels, or NGO bodies with delegated authority. Not only are a lot of domestic bodies involved, but the range of measures that would come under this agreement is also quite broad. There's a very broad definition on measure, and also the fact that it would apply to the entire life cycle of the investment. So I'm just highlighting this point just because some participants have mentioned that because they think the scope is broad, they're worried that implementation, the agreement could be a challenge. And that's one concern as to why they have, why they've publicly stated this is a reason as to why they haven't joined the agreement. Now, moving on to section 2. So section 2 is the first of the substantive sections. And in this case, what the governments are mainly committing to do are improve their transparency efforts relating to investment policies. So the most of the obligations here are really publication requirements in which the parties are promising to make sure that important government information that targets FDI activities, such as laws, regulations, other types of practical information, what they're promising to do is make sure that all this information is not only publicly available, it's also available in a timely manner. They're going to try and make this information available online, and ideally, if feasible, via a single information portal. So the idea here is that by making information easily accessible to foreign investors, this reduces their information gathering costs and would function as an incentive to essentially increase their investments into the country. Beyond the publication requirements, you also have notification requirements where parties will improve their reporting of new laws and regulations on investment policy making to the WTO Secretariat itself. Moving on to section 3, this is also another important substantive section of the agreement. It's really quite detailed with a range of provisions, but the main objective here really is governments are essentially agreeing to improve their authorization procedures relating to FDI activities. And the idea here is that they'll try to make them much more predictable and effective. And the hope is that by reducing bureaucratic hassle in regard to authorization procedures, this in turn will again function as an incentive that can hopefully facilitate additional investments. Once again, there's a whole range of requirements here, and it is worth spending time familiarizing yourself with it, the details, but examples of obligations are, parties will ensure putting in place certain standards of impartiality, objectivity when developing their new administrative measures, or they're also promising to make sure that certain application procedures include certain features such as ensuring a reasonable time frame, attempts to make sure that authenticated copies are accepted, to putting in place a review process. So these are really very detailed technical points that are very process step oriented, And it's really important to therefore just take the time to better understand those details, to get a sense of like what would it take to implement this agreement. Moving on to section 4, which is a relatively shorter section when it comes to the substance. And here, what the parties are committing to do is essentially put in place longer-term institutional mechanisms that aims to improve cooperation, not just among the parties themselves, but also between the governments and the investors directly. So there's a range of processes that parties are going to be trying to put in place. For example, they'll set up a focal point that that will be there available to respond to questions from investors, to remove focusing on ground level obstacles. They'll also be setting up a database that makes it easier for foreign investors to access information on domestic suppliers. And finally, they're also going to try and put in place supplier development programs that enhance the capacity of local suppliers so that they can better meet the need of foreign investors. Here, really, the idea is like strengthening the linkages between investors to local suppliers so that the host state is able to benefit from those linkages. Section 5 is going to be an important section. It's a section on special and differential treatment, which of course is very important for developing and least developed countries, as it grants them with additional rights and flexibilities when it comes to the implementation of this agreement. Sorry. So what this section recognizes is that developing and LDC members may not be able to comply with all the obligations of this agreement right away. They just simply may not have the capacity to do so. So what this section allows them to do is essentially undertake a self-assessment in which they're able to analyze the extent to which their domestic framework is already complying with the obligations within this agreement. And based on that self-assessment, they're able to determine, highlight which are the provisions that they can comply with right away, which are the articles they can comply with only after a certain amount of time, which are category B, and which are the articles they can only comply with after not only just additional time, but contingent on capacity building support being provided. And this is known as category C. This should be a really familiar section for WTO members because it's essentially a replica of the S&DT approach that's been put in place through the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Beyond the article on designations, there's also several other additional flexibilities and benefits provided, from deadline extensions to the flexibilities to move between designations and categories should assumptions change, access to the an expert group should there be difficulty in implementation, and then and various other elements prior to the potential risk of a claim eventually being opened. So there is essentially there's a bigger timeline before a risk of a dispute emerges in the case of non-compliance with implementation, but due to these additional flexibilities. Okay. Moving on to section 6. Now, Ambassador Boza went into some really important information on this, and as she mentioned, really the objective of this section, which is referred to as the section which is the Sustainable Investments section, the purpose of this section is to include what parties are expecting is by implementing these articles, they don't just expect to facilitate any kind of investments, but what they're hoping is that these articles will be useful for facilitating higher quality investments, which essentially delivers higher value for sustainability. There's 2 articles here. The first requires the host state to essentially encourage foreign businesses that are operating within their territory to incorporate responsible business conduct practices and policies within their business practices. The second provision article focuses on, requires parties to develop anti-corruption policies under the scope of this agreement. Now, this section is quite an innovation for the WTO because this is the first time the WTO has incorporated specific articles that are dedicated to, that are focused on enhancing socially responsible behavior within its within an agreement. So it is really important to applaud that effort of integrating provisions that are dedicated to sustainability. But it is also important to highlight that this is the only section. I mean, the articles are still quite limited. There are only 2 articles that are focusing on sustainable investment. And the second point to highlight is, like, this is the only section which has been explicitly excluded from Article 34 in dispute settlement proceedings. So in case implementation is if a country does not implement the articles in this under this section, there is no risk of a dispute being raised against them to force them into compliance. And that's fine because we recognize that flexibilities may be needed, but it does create a hierarchy of sorts between, let's say, the sustainability focused provisions versus the non-sustainability focused provisions. So that is one element to keep in mind. And finally, section 7 is the institutional arrangements and final provisions. It really is just it's the concluding chapter, which gives additional clarity on exceptions, and it details what the committee that's set up under this agreement, what it would focus on. It's also going to give some additional clarity on accession and withdrawal processes that's available to parties who want to newly join this agreement and parties who would want to exit the agreement, given that this is a plurilateral agreement. And then there's also clarity that this agreement applies to would be able to benefit from the dispute settlement proceedings under the WTO framework, should it get incorporated into the WTO framework. So that's just a really quick overview, but I hope it's been useful in giving you a sense of what's in the agreement. And just as a basis of understanding what's being discussed in the run-up to MC13. Now, I want to close my presentation with just emphasizing a couple of points on what other elements can be expected in the run-up to MC13. Really, the main question that's outstanding is the question of legal architecture. And here, the question is, will the participants of this process, will they be able to convince the full WTO membership, all 164 members? And this includes members who aren't currently signed on to this joint statement initiative. Will they be able to convince those non-parties to provide their permission, their consensus, so that this agreement can be legally incorporated into the WTO framework as a plurilateral agreement under Annex 4. This conversation of legal integration is expected to be quite challenging and is expected to be quite a relevant topic at the MC13. The reason it's expected to be challenging is because some members, such as India and South Africa, have been very vocal opponents on these joint statement initiatives, stating that they're in which they've questioned the legality of having launched these processes in the first place, because the negotiations were launched without the full consensus of the full WTO membership, and therefore they argue that these processes are therefore illegal under the WTO mandate. But I mean, and the question here is, like, will you be able to convince those parties, those members who have been very vocal critics, can you get them around to essentially give their consensus in order for this agreement to be integrated within the broader WTO framework? And that's really just going to be a very politically charged conversation. That's surely going to be a dominating force at the MC13. And it's not just going to have an implication on whether this specific agreement can get incorporated into the WTO framework. It will likely have a knock-on effect on whether the e-commerce agreement can eventually get incorporated into the WTO framework, and also can determine the extent to which variable geometry is essentially going to be facilitated through the WTO in the future. And this is really one of the main debates that's taking place. The question here is like, to what extent should the WTO become a platform that facilitates broader plurilateral initiatives that is able to cater to a much more diverse membership base? Or should the priority still be on focusing on a multilateral agenda that's able to maintain all voices, but can fall risk to deadlock and stasis? So that's one key debate that's going to be fought out, let's say, at the MC13. And the outcome of that conversation is really going to determine what's going to happen with this agreement. If the parties are able to get the consensus of all the full membership, then this agreement would get integrated within the WTO framework. If that consensus doesn't come about, the question is what's going to happen next? Is this agreement going to be dropped altogether, or will it be able to continue as an RTA arrangement outside the WTO? So that's an open question. Finally, I would like to just close by stating that there's a lot of really, really valuable briefs and resources that we've produced. And in the slide, you'll see a summary of a curated summary of what we recommend that you should read. That's going to be useful for MC13. I'd also like to highlight that we're going to be publishing a reader's guide that's essentially going to explain, that's going to be an accompanying report that gives you an explanation of what's in the agreement and helps you understand the agreement without necessarily having to parse through the legal text yourself. So we hope that reader's guide is going to be useful as an accompanying tool in your preparations for MC13. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rashmi, for covering a lot of ground in your presentation, from the larger investment policy facilitation global scene to the details of some of the important provisions of this draft agreement, and then ending by highlighting the key remaining legal, political, practical questions. So, and that's where now I will request our next speaker, my good friend, Joel Richards, Consular Permanent Delegation of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States in the Geneva Mission, to talk about the development dimension and implementation challenges. OECS and Joel has been at the forefront of these issues in the JSI negotiations, and he would be the perfect person to briefly throw light on those issues. So Joel, you have the floor, maybe 6-7 minutes or so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rashid, and good afternoon to everyone. Good morning, depending on where you are in the world. It's certainly a pleasure to be here, and 7 minutes should suffice. And many thanks to the IFDA team for putting together this event. I will be touching very briefly on the special and differential treatment and the technical assistance and capacity building provisions in the investment facilitation agreement. And those provisions are contained in Section 5 of the agreement. And I want to start on the first premise that the emerging disciplines, and I want to make a case upfront as to why special and differential treatment and technical assistance and capacity building were so integral to these negotiations. And it is simply because of the fact that the breadth and scope of the disciplines which have been negotiated are so broad that it would require a fairly Herculean effort on the part of developing and least developed countries to pull together the technical, financial, human, and institutional resources to implement the disciplines. Now, when you look at the trade facilitation agreement, for example, and suffice to say that this section on special and differential treatment would have been significantly modeled off of the trade facilitation agreement template. But the TFA, if we were to make a comparison, does not implicate as wide a range of stakeholders or as wide a range of disciplines as the investment facilitation agreement. And therefore, the case for the kind of approach which has been adopted to technical assistance and capacity building was actually an easy case to make because developing countries and LDCs would certainly need the resources to implement. And we have to approach the agreement on the basis that implementation is in the interest of these members because it's about facilitating FDI, foreign direct investment, for the purpose of national development. And therefore, the further delay or the extent to which there are delays in implementation, it creates a deficit with respect to the ability of those countries to benefit from the provisions. So I wanted to set that context. And then that takes me to the second broad point I wanted to make. And if we were to look at the preambular section to special and differential treatment, for example, it also sets the context in terms of how we are to understand these provisions on special and differential treatment and technical assistance and capacity building. And first and foremost, there's a recognition by members and an acknowledgement at the very beginning that members have an appreciation of the special difficulties of developing countries and least developed countries. And these special difficulties relate to their relative lack of capacity with respect to implementation. The second broad principle, which sort of sets up the agreement for developing countries, is also this recognition that assistance should be provided to help members implement the agreement. So having acknowledged that these difficulties exist, there's then that commitment to provide assistance. And then the extent and timing of implementation, importantly, correlates to the implementation capacities of developing countries and least developed countries. So there is an understanding that there needs to be an acquisition of capacity on the part of these countries in order to make for effective implementation of the disciplines. And then the final general principle I want to speak to is and it's specific to least developed countries, is that they will only be required to undertake the commitments to the extent consistent with their individual development or financial needs or administrative and implementation capacities. Okay, so there's that recognition, but having consideration for the context I said earlier, that implementation is in the interest of these countries. So the extent to which there are gaps with respect to capacities, it's extremely important that those gaps be filled as quickly as possible. So even though there might be certain timelines in place, it would be in the interest of these countries to even expedite those timelines more, which means there will need to be consideration for expedited capacity to be acquired as well. So there's that symbiotic relationship between the acquisition of capacity and the gaps that exist with respect to that capacity in the first place. I also want to make special reference to footnote 33 in the text, which clarifies that assistance and support for capacity building may take the form of technical, financial, or any other mutually agreed form of assistance. And this was very important because I think it was important to signal to developing countries and least developed countries that the kind of technical assistance or the kind of special and differential treatment envisioned was not only limited to the technical resources. It's not only limited to coming in and doing a study or doing a needs assessment, but there is a recognition as well that there might need to be a commitment of financial resources to facilitate implementation. And that I believe was a very important part of the agreement. Having said that, just to indicate that footnote 34, if I may go there as well. And this is an important point because footnote 34 also commits members, and here we're talking about the donor members, to provide assistance for needs assessments for these countries. So I made a point that there are these very expansive set of disciplines which have been agreed. For instance, if you looked at section 2, which covers transparency of investment measures, and section 3, streamlining and speeding up administrative procedures, which contain the bulk of the hard disciplines in the agreement, you'd realize that members will be invited to undertake an extensive set of commitments, which many developing countries and least developed countries would not be able to implement without the support. But in order to know what kind of support is required, it was extremely important for members to undertake what we refer to as a self-assessment or needs assessment process. And a similar process was conducted in the Trade Facilitation Agreement. And what needs assessments would lead to is to provide developing countries and donor members with an evidentiary basis on which implementation can be done. And so it would allow members to categorize their implementation capacity along the lines of category A, which would be those measures that they can implement immediately upon entry into force of the agreement. It would allow them to identify their category B commitments, which would be those measures which they can identify on the basis of having more time and being able to having more time to implement. And invariably, it might be through the use of their own resources, just that they need more time. Category C measures would then involve those measures which would require both additional time as well as an acquisition of capacity or resources to implement. And the needs assessments are critical to that process, because without the needs assessments, it means that that categorization of implementation capacity would be done in circumstances, it would be on the basis of guessing. And that would not be a sufficient condition on which to undertake these kinds of obligations. And so that's why the needs assessments was so important. And that's why the footnote that is there to clarify that assistance should be provided for this purpose was so critical. So I've gone through the needs assessments. I've looked at the different categories of commitments. I would then just quickly indicate, and I think Rashmi would have mentioned that there is the possibility of also shifting between the implementation commitments. You can shift between categories B and C, for instance. So developing country may have signaled that they only needed time, but on further consideration, they may realize that they need both time and resources. And they can therefore then shift from category B to C. Or they might have a measure in category C and realize they don't need resources, they only need time, and they can shift it back to category B. And there's this early warning mechanism which has been built into the agreement as well, which would allow any developing member, for instance, if you can project that you are going to have some difficulties in meeting your implementation timelines, then that early warning mechanism allows you to signal that to the committee, and the committee can then take a decision in terms of giving you additional time to bring your measures into effect. The final aspect I want to touch on relates to technical assistance and capacity building and what is envisioned in the agreement. Now, we always argued throughout the life of the negotiations that we should not only be looking at the agreement as a static instrument, but we needed to consider the broader ecosystem of investment facilitation and foreign direct investment attraction. And if you look at how the disciplines on TACB were crafted, it was really with that in mind. So for instance, it speaks to the building of expertise in relevant authorities to strengthen their capacities to maximize the positive impacts of investment. And that's not just limited to what's in the text. At least that's our understanding and reading of that particular provision. The other important element of TACB, and it's an indicative list, it's open. So it includes these, and it could be others that countries could mutually agree between themselves and donor members. But the other critical aspect of TACB is that support is envisioned to build capacity for the preparation of feasibility studies for investment projects, including environmental and social impact assessments and regulatory and administrative requirements. And I believe the speaker that's coming after me may shed some light on, for instance, some of the maybe where the agreement falls short in terms of there hasn't been an identification of, say, sectors which might be ripe for the kinds of enhanced facilitation activities for sustainable development-based investments. But here we are making reference to support for environmental and social impact assessments, because the implication there is that we are not only looking at the universe of investments, but there's a qualitative type of investment that there's an interest in, and those would be where developing country has said there are certain types of investments that are germane to my own sustainable development objectives. We need support to be able to undertake the relevant environmental and social impact assessments so that perhaps we can provide the enhanced facilitation services to those types of investments. I think I'll leave it there for now, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Joel. Thank you. We are quite conscious that there is a lot that needs to be said and the time is short. And then, of course, you very eloquently describe the magnitude, depth, and breadth of the capacity building needs and implementation needs. And then, of course, the role of needs assessment also in that regard. Let me just quickly say before I request our final speaker that my colleague Samiksha has now in the chat put up this feedback survey. There's a link there. So I would request the participants. So kindly click on this link and quickly give us that feedback as we move towards the remaining speakers. Also, there were a question in the question answer, which Rashmi has replied. And since we may not have time at the end to have a more oral question answer, so I would encourage any of you who would like to answer ask a question or make a comment, you can use that function, and we will then use after the last speaker, take some time to briefly respond to those questions. So thank you very much, Joel, again, and thank you so much, Professor Kalamita, for your patience. You are the last speaker, but certainly not the least. Professor Johnson Kalamita is Head Investment Law and Policy, Center for International Law, Research Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law of the National University of Singapore. So thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rashid. I trust that my slides are visible on the screen. It's a great privilege to be with you today and to talk about the IFDA. And thank you to IASD for the opportunity. As has already been said, it's especially important and timely in light of the forthcoming MC. Just by way of background, I've been working on investment facilitation issues for the last 4 years, both academically and with governments, and focusing particularly on the scope of the obligations and their potential costs and benefits. So today I want to briefly address 3 important aspects of the IFDA as I see them. One is its relationship to investment protection treaties and investor-state dispute settlement. 2, the way in which the self-assessment process that Joel's just described might actually be used to help developing or least developed states actually improve their capacity to avoid investment treaty disputes. And 3, offer some observations about the relationship between the provisions of the IFDA and sustainable development and climate change. So let me jump right in. One of the concerns that has been raised and was raised during the drafting were potential interactions between the IFDA and investment protection treaties. And the reason for that is that the IFDA addresses the kinds of issues of regulatory transparency, efficiency, predictability, etc., that Rashmi was talking about. And those happen to be the very same kinds of issues that arise in the context of investment treaty disputes, particularly with regard to fair and equitable treatment claims. And as a consequence, their concerns were raised that investors might seek to rely upon the IFDA disciplines either to interpret the host state's investment protection obligations and expand them. They might raise umbrella claim arguments with respect to the commitment by states with regard to the IFDA. They might seek to directly incorporate the obligations in the IFDA through the use of a most favored nation clause in the investment treaty. So the drafters have clearly tried to address these concerns, and there are multiple provisions in the IFDA that are designed to limit or exclude interactions between the IAAs, between ISDS and the Investment Facilitation Agreement. And the articles are there. I won't go into the nitty-gritty about the way in which those articles are drafted. I think suffice to say that it's not watertight. And frankly, it couldn't be watertight without actually amending the investment treaties themselves. But it is a best effort, I think, to reduce the risk that the investment facilitation agreement will be invoked by private parties in ISDS. There is, however, no guarantee and no assurances, especially when it comes to ISDS decision-making by arbitral tribunals. The second point that I wanted to talk about is the possible synergy, actually, that might exist, though, between states adopting the IFDA and improving their prospects for avoiding investment treaty disputes. So, as Joel was talking about, the self-assessment process puts states in a position to determine whether or not they're going to be able to meet obligations upon a session. Now, this creates an opportunity really to kill two birds with one stone, because when states conduct these self-assessment opportunities, they're reviewing their regulatory processes to see whether they provide transparency, whether they provide predictability, whether they provide degrees of administrative efficiency and fairness. And we know that the vast majority of investment treaty disputes arise out of questions concerning administrative processes and administrative practices. So when the state's undertaking a self-assessment exercise to look at the IFDA, it should also be doing so with an eye on how its current regulatory practices actually line up to its international investment treaty obligations. So this really then provides the state with indispensable information, not only with regard to whether it will be able to implement the IFDA's obligations, but also with respect to the current state of affairs with regard to its investment treaty compliance, its possibility of establishing investment treaty dispute prevention programs, and ultimately its future treaty negotiation policy to understand where it may have vulnerabilities in its existing system. So I think this is, it's certainly not on the face of the agreement, the IFDA agreement, but it is something that states would do well to take in mind, because it's a real unique opportunity, as states will already be going through the regulatory systems, line by line, effectively, in these self-assessment exercises, to kill two birds with one stone, capitalize on what you're already doing for multiple purposes. The key issue, Joel highlighted this, is going to be the availability of funding and technical assistance for the self-assessment process. Footnote 34, as Joel mentioned, talks about that, but show me the money, as they say. We'll have to see, exactly what are donor states willing to provide, especially if they're going to provide additional assistance at the implementation stage. The last section, the last set of issues that I wanted to raise, and I'm conscious of the time, but concerns the IFDA, sustainable and development investment, and climate change. And I have to say that from my perspective, the provisions on sustainable development investment in the IFDA are terribly thin. The objective is, as Rashmi pointed out, of the agreement is spelled out in Article 1, is to facilitate flows of FDI with an aim towards fostering sustainable development. But that said, what we find in the agreement on sustainable investment, as Rashmi pointed out, we have Article 37, which is directed to host states, encouraging corporate social responsibility for the investors who invest in their states. But of course, nothing already prevents host states from doing that. That doesn't really add anything to what states are currently able or capable of doing. And moreover, what's telling is that it doesn't place any obligations on the home state of the investor to encourage them or ensure that they act in a socially responsible way when operating outside of their home territory. With respect to Article 38, the anti-corruption, again, I don't really think that adds a great deal. All of the states considering joining this agreement are already parties to the UN Anti-Corruption Convention, which provides and requires exactly the same things as are contained in Article 38. Moving away from the sustainability and sustainable development investment to climate change, it's sad that there's not a single mention of climate change in the entire agreement, not even in the preamble. And as it's framed, the commitments in the agreement apply to all FDI, regardless of whether it tends to promote sustainable development, regardless of whether it's aligned with the Paris Agreement, all. That said, IFDA does not affect or apply to subsidies, and doesn't require market liberalization for investment. So no states continue to be at liberty to not admit investments that they don't think are going to meet their sustainable development goals or are Paris aligned. And it doesn't appear to prohibit states offering further benefits beyond those that are required by the IFDA to preferred investments like green investments. And I think that's reinforced by the incorporation of the exceptions language of GATS Article 14 and the ability of states under that article to act particularly and take measures in pursuit of protection of environment, human health, plant life, and so forth. So I think it's not that it exposes states necessarily to particular risks of liability or so forth. It's just that it seems a bit of a missed opportunity, in my opinion, with regard to sustainability and to climate change. I hope I haven't gone too far over my 8 minutes, but thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Kalamita. That was excellent. And not only you linked very well to some earlier presentations, but also very nicely and clearly filled in some points, elaborated on them, particularly the concerns about IIA relationship and how has that been addressed. Then also how it can be actually a synergy in avoiding IISDS disputes, and then of course the sustainability issue and how it's been addressed. So excellent, I think, final presentation of this webinar. I would not try to summarize because both for the time that we have and then also the depth and breadth of presentations and discussions. So my quick reflections will be a few ones, starting from that, yes, the developments on the global investment policy, investment facilitation scene have been quite broad. And within that context, this agreement, as Rashmi said, has the potential to be the new global benchmark. And if you look at that and then look at the agreement, and as the other presentations showed by Joel, Professor Kalamita, Ambassador Boza, its coverage is quite broad, quite extensive in terms of the actors covered and the measures covered, which immediately takes us to the question of the implementation in terms of the capacities, human, financial, technical, institutional. And so on the one hand, a lot of flexibilities, but to be able to make use of that, as Professor Kalamita, I think he used the word, show me the money. So yeah, so that phrase is quite relevant. And that's where probably a lot would need to be done. But that does not distract us from the two of the immediate challenges, which Ambassador Boza mentioned. One, whether the whole membership reaches a consensus by MC13 before, after, because that's where it hinges upon that, whether this is a plurilateral agreement within the WTO or some other form. And then the other, of course, is, which I think the questions and the responses showed, and Professor Kalamita's presentation, yes, there is a lot that needs to be understood, its relationship with other arrangements and agreements, as well as what it actually covers, what it actually may not cover, but still can be used, like for climate change and sustainable development friendly investment. So there is a lot in this that would require further reflections, thought, understanding. And that's where I would encourage you to keep looking for this guide, reader's guide, that is being prepared by Rashmi and other colleagues at IIST. I think that would be explaining quite a few things in the agreement, which can help us all in developing better understanding and trying to take most advantage of this potential agreement. So with these final reflections, before I formally close the webinar, let me say very sincere thanks on behalf of myself, on behalf of Alice, IIST, our speakers, Ambassador Boza, Professor Kalamita, Rashmi, and Joel, who is not here. Thank you so much for your excellent presentations, responses, and time. And of course, very sincere thanks to all the participants. I took a quick look. It seemed we had participants from all over the world, including from Geneva, and they stayed till the end. So that's great. So thank you so much. And of course, then my dear IIST colleagues, Rashmi, Maria, Samiksha, Daniel, Maria. So a lot of them worked a lot to put this webinar together. So sincere thanks to them all. And finally, to our interpreters, who I'm sure I don't speak French, I don't speak Spanish, so but I'm sure they would have done a great job. So thank you very much, all of you. And with this, I bring this to a formal closure and wishing you a very good remaining day or evening, and look forward to our continuing collaboration in the future as well. So bye for now.